that environmental problems are both profound and challenging. The mission of Pace Academy for Applied Environmental Studies is premised upon the reality that solutions require the application of knowledge from every relevant discipline. We believe this is a particular responsibility for higher education. There was a time when the term applied had largely negative connotations. Many believed that applied science was the enemy of basic science, as if an unsolved policy question or an environmental catastrophe could not be the basis of probing research. More than any contemporary issue, climate change has rolled back the stone on applied research, applied thinking, and applied knowledge. It has created new fields of study at the nexus of science, policy, and communications in particular. More important, it has shined a spotlight on how dependent our future is on our collective and collection, and interpretation of information and data about the daily and historical impacts of our species. In tonight's conversation, you will have the benefit of hearing not just current thinking about climate, but also a dialogue between two people with a long history in climate change research and reporting. This multi-decade perspective is as important as knowing the current status of global climate and climate issues. When issues like this emerge, people sort of come to it in waves, right? In other words, it's an important current issue, so therefore we have to pay attention. And yet, the 1972 Coastal Zone Management Act cites sea level rise as one of the reasons for drafting the statute. In fact, it can be found in the CZMA's findings and purpose of the legislation. So climate change spans 4 decades. It's not simply a current issue. Michael Oppenheimer has been at the forefront of proposing global policies and scientific findings. Andrew Revkin has been communicating and interpreting climate change science and the language of climate change as important as anything else. Together, they're going to impart tonight how people's understanding of climate change has changed, how the scientific understanding of climate change has changed, how political views have changed, and how these changes may impact the way forward. We're thrilled to have Dr. Michael Oppenheimer at Pace Academies as a visiting fellow this year. Over our 4 days of having him in residence throughout the year, he's given guest lectures and classes, he's given public talks like this, speaking with student groups, and participating in faculty seminars on both of our campuses. Dr. Michael Oppenheimer is a longtime participant in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. He served as a lead author of IPCC's 4th assessment report, and recently as a coordinating lead author of the 5th assessment report, as well as special report on climate extremes and disasters. His work on this issue dates back to the late 1980s, when Dr. Oppenheimer and a handful of other scientists organized 2 workshops under the auspices of the United Nations that helped precipitate the negotiations that resulted in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed at the 1992 Earth Summit, and the Kyoto Protocol. During that period, he co-founded the Climate Action Network. Dr. Oppenheimer is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs in the Woodrow Wilson School and the Department of Geosciences at Princeton University. He is also the Director of the Program in Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy at the Woodrow Wilson School. And he is the Faculty Associate of the Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences Program, the Princeton Environmental Institute, the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. Dr. Oppenheimer joined the Princeton faculty after more than 2 decades with the Environmental Defense Fund, where he served as Chief Scientist and Manager of the Climate and Air Program. And he continues to serve as a science advisor to EDF. He has been a member of several panels of the National Academy of Sciences and is now a member of the National Academy's Board on Energy and Environmental Studies. Dr. Oppenheimer is a 2010 winner of the prestigious Heinz Award and a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science. His research and advocacy work on acid rain also contributed to the passage of the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. Dr. Oppenheimer has been a guest on many television and radio programs, including ABC's This Week, Nightline, Alcove, The NewsHour, The Oprah Winfrey Show, Charlie Rose, ABC News, and probably most popularly, Colbert Report. Prior to his position at the Environmental Defense Fund, Dr. Oppenheimer served as the atomic and molecular astrophysicist at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics and lecturer on astronomy at Harvard University. He received an SB in chemistry from MIT, a PhD in chemical physics from the University of Chicago, and pursued postdoctoral research at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Dr. Oppenheimer is the author of over 100 articles published in professional journals, as a co-author with Robert H. Boyle of a 1990 book called Dead Heat: The Race Against the Greenhouse Effect. Welcome, Dr. Oppenheimer.
Thank you.
Also joining us tonight is Andrew Revkin, Senior Fellow for Environmental Understanding at Pace Academy for Applied Environmental Studies, and creator and blogger for the New York Times' .Earth blog. And he has been writing about environmental and social sustainability for more than 3 decades, from the Amazon to the White House, the Hudson Valley to the North Pole, mainly for the New York Times. He has won the top awards in science journalism multiple times, along with the Guggenheim Fellowship. And he has written on global warming science and solutions and energy issues since the 1980s. At Pace, Andy teaches courses in blogging, environmental communication, and documentary film. He's written acclaimed books on global warming, the changing Arctic, and the violent assault on the Amazon rainforest, as well as 3 book chapters on science communication. Drawing on his experience with his Times blog.earth, which Time magazine named one of the top 25 blogs in 2013, Andy speaks to audiences around the world about paths to progress on a turbulent planet. 2 films have been based on his work, Rockstar and The Burning Season, which won 2 Emmy Awards and 3 Golden Globes. Andy received a degree in biology from Brown University and a master's in journalism from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. In his spare moments, he's a performing songwriter, recently releasing his first album of original songs, A Very Fine Line. Welcome, Andy. Thank you for joining us. And I now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. So we're going to do this kind of as a conversation. When I talk to scientists about how to handle interviews with the media, one thing I encourage them to do is to treat it like conversation, not a one-way street. Like years ago at a meeting, a science meeting, where I gave a talk like this, I said, you know, you could just say at the end of an interview with some reporter, okay, now what are you taking away from this? You're the scientist. It's like being a professor. You can kind of say, turn the table. So I'm hoping we're going to treat it that way. So he'll be asking me some questions too. And there's a lot to go over. I think what we're going to try to do is not so much focus on the facts of this climate science, because as I said on my blog.earth, I did a piece about this event. We've gleaned a lot of facts through our decades working on this question, but it's more about what are the overarching lessons you've learned, Michael and maybe me, in grappling with a problem as momentous and unusual as the climate problem. It's very different than old-fashioned pollution problems. It's not a pollution problem from many standpoints. It's bigger than that. So my first question for Michael is, and hopefully for the online folks, make sure you weigh in on this discussion using the hashtag #ClimateSciPress. #ClimateSciPress. I think it's up there. And you can do that too, but we're going to ask you for questions as well. Briefly, how did you get into this mess? I mean, you know, you're a bright guy. You're going to focus on astrophysics with the sky in mind, but what led you to the climate challenge?
The first time I ever heard of the climate change issue was actually back in the late 1960s when I was a graduate student. And I read about it in, I think it was in the Tech Review, the alumni magazine at MIT. And it scared the hell out of me. The sound of it was not good. But I put it away because I was just learning about atomic and molecular physics, and I didn't have time to think too much about these kinds of questions. And but it kept percolating with me. I was involved in the first Earth Day in 1970, teaching a second grade class. Everybody in Chicago, where I was, went out and did something. And I then went on to a standard scientific career, but in the middle of the first decade of that career, I found it dissatisfying to do research on astrophysics, because as beautiful and poetic as it was, as interesting as the science was, it had absolutely nothing to do with anything I really cared about. And I started getting interested in the environment. I got interested in acid rain, and I brought back my concern about global warming, I started looking for a career change. I had a permanent job at the Harvard Observatory, and I basically threw away a good career and went to work for EDF, which happened to work out too, by the way.
Yeah.
And as soon as I got there, I started thinking about climate change. The first intervention on climate change that I did was, as soon as I got to EDF, I was asked to testify before the Congressional Committee. Waxman was the chairman, that was looking into the revising the Clean Air Act. And I added a line to my testimony about, I hope you folks can deal with acid rain, because climate change is an even worse problem you're going to have to deal with later. And the National Clean Air Coalition, for whom I was testifying, made me take that sentence out of the testimony, because they thought Congress couldn't deal with two issues at once.
And
things have not gotten better.
I was just going to say. So was there, to me, one of my learning curve moments was realizing this is not like acid rain.
Right.
Did you have a realization of that sort? Did you presume it was kind of a pollution problem early on?
No, I think just because I noticed, when I first read about it, I noted it as different. And it's the fundamental thing that's different really is this business of CO2 having essentially, for all practical purposes, an infinite lifetime in the atmosphere. And it just made it different from air pollution, which disappears very quickly. By the time I got around to really thinking about climate change, doing research on it in the early 1980s, I understood acid rain very well, understood carbon dioxide, and understood the difference. But it is notable that the community as a whole didn't understand some of the basic features of how carbon dioxide behaves in the atmosphere until well into the 1980s. And that's because the issue of, could you actually slow the warming down? Could you stabilize the atmosphere? Could you maybe return the climate to what it used to be? That was still an open question in the mid-80s. And people actually, when I first got into it, this was a remarkable thing. They thought all we could do would be slow down the warming, that Earth inevitably was going to get a lot warmer and just continue to warm. Now we have a different perspective, which is you can actually envision a solution to the problem.
Well, although you've kind of just laid out this contentious question of geoengineering, adding other stuff to the atmosphere to counteract the heating effect of this.
That's not what I was proposing. But
no, I know, but it's
bring it up. Yeah.
One way of someone reacting to the scenario you laid out would be the geoengineering idea. I don't want to do a long discussion of that, but frankly, I think it's a non-starter in the sense that I don't know about you, but I can't foresee a scenario where a lone actor is going to start lofting tens of millions of pounds of sulfur into the atmosphere to create a cloud to counteract global warming. A lone country, a lone actor.
Right.
There's no there. I may be wrong.
No, you have hit the nail on the head. There are two reasons why this I don't think will ever be implemented. Number one, the scientific uncertainty is going to remain large, so no country thinking about doing it will know whether it's going to win or lose. And second of all, other countries, even if one country gets convinced and they want to go ahead, other countries, many of them are not going to like it. And this has the possibilities of all kinds of nasty scenarios. By and large, very well intended. They think it's an interesting possibility, and some think it's actually a practical possibility. I just think they did it wrong.
I agree. So we'll set that
Start
aside.
right there.
Okay.
Good.
Onward.
How did you get into this issue?
I grew up wanting to be a marine biologist. I grew up in Rhode Island, near the sea, and I remember the first time I put on a mask and snorkeled around and saw a scallop swimming, a mollusk other than a squid, this just a swimming bivalve. I think that really is why I wanted to study biology. But then I was in college, I got a biology degree, and I kind of realized that I didn't really have it in me to get a PhD. I hit that wall where you think about 5 or 7 years doing the same thing, studying that one little question, and it just later on, my sister-in-law teaches learning disabled kids, and she said I'm too ADD to ever consider getting a PhD. But journalism is perfect for like that quality, because I'm like, wow, it's all interesting. And I ended
We
up,
all have our strengths and weaknesses.
yeah, I know, right. And I ended up overseas, and it was when I was on a trip out after I decided to be a journalist. I saw so many interesting things changing so rapidly that and my first big magazine article in 1983 was on an herbicide that was being misused in developing countries because they didn't have, the labeling went away. It kind of got sold in a nice jug with a big skull and crossbones, but then it got decanted into little jars, and several thousand people a year were dying by drinking this stuff. And that was my first piece in 1983. And then I brought along an artifact for those. There were these things called magazines, like a printed, there's this printed object that you carried with you. You can pass it around even. 1985, I wrote my first article about climate change, about human-driven climate change. It was about nuclear winter, not about global warming. It was about, that was the Cold War, you know, we were going to geoengineer, we were going to burn enough cities, there'd be enough schmutz in the air that it would cool the planet, crop failures, etc. But then what intrigued me, you know, and I was also writing about supercomputer security and the space race and, you know, the space shuttle program. But then I met Steve Schneider, someone we both knew for decades, and he did a follow-up study on nuclear winter. I dug in a little more with Starley Thompson, and they came out with a paper calling it Nuclear Autumn. And that was interesting to me, because for the first time, I really was starting to understand the news cycle and how something that can be initially really powerfully scary, and then you dig in on it more and more. Science actually doesn't make things simpler sometimes. It makes it more complicated.
Right.
And I got hooked. I kind of got hooked on this question. And then 1988, along came, you know, the burning of Yellowstone and Jim Hanson's testimony. And that's when I did my first big article on global warming. And then people ask, well, how could you possibly write about this kind of thing, so depressing, et cetera, for so long? But it's unbelievably interesting.
It is interesting, but I find in my own head, I get asked that all the time. I make kind of a disconnect. I found a way, and I don't know how, to not personalize it.
So the intellectual, I think
it's the only way to do it, frankly.
Well, without going insane.
Without going nuts, yeah.
Well, to me, I think that's part of it. I distance myself from things by thinking about them.
Right. So we all have our psychological mechanisms.
So we're a subset of, you're looking at us, partly an artificially torqued part of the climate conversation.
I don't know if it's such a great characteristic to have as part of your personality, but it works.
Well, and it gives you, you know, and then you can work on it. You know, you can kind of work on it. So that's what led me into this. And then, and this will get to some other questions we could talk about. One, it's that you start to realize this is not just a science question. And this relates to what Melanie Dupuy is doing, and we're doing here at PACE, in converging everything from philosophy to climatology and dealing with environmental policies and questions. The data just tell you, is this a soccer game or a field hockey? The rules of the game, how we decide to respond to that data is about everything from psychology to philosophy to everything else. So again, as a journalist, that was the other part of it.
I don't think I had that realization until I've been working on the problem for about 10 years. It wasn't obvious to me. I used to approach it particularly just straight as a physicist. Mm-hmm. And it turned out a lot of great work was done going back to the 1970s about the social side of the problem. Steve certainly was early on it. And it is a problem that you can't, it's in the wrong frame if you just put it in the scientific frame. That there's no really way to separate the human side from the scientific side. If you do that, you're not going to develop a solution to the problem.
And interestingly, it was Ken Caldera, who was a climate scientist. I only took one course in philosophy as an undergrad. And so it was Ken Caldera, who I think minored in philosophy, who he first conveyed to me the writings of David Hume, who said you can't get an ought from an is. And that's, the data is the is, science delineates it, but the ought is values, it's everybody.
The normative side is the bigger part of the problem right now. What people think should be done. And once you get there, you can't separate it from the whole values scenario.
I have a quick question. Are these just for the online, or are they going in through the system?
We're having it outside.
Can you do the songwriter thing and hold this up to your mouth? Let's see. Is that, can you hear? Is that actually?
Yeah.
You can plug it back in.
We hear you fine back here.
Okay, can you hear us even better now?
Yes.
We'll do the talk show thing. Like Mike, who is the... So anyway.
I won't sing because it would be very disappointing.
Yeah, so we should probably talk about that thing called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate
The
Change.
IPCC, yes. Well, it's got a very interesting history. The IPCC was set up in 1988 originally, and part of the reason it was set up, not the only reason, it was a proposal that had been floating around. But in the late 1980s, a bunch of scientists and international organizations started stimulating interest in the problem. The US government got afraid that somehow this interest would run away from them and something would actually threaten to get done about the problem, which the US government at that point was not interested in seeing happen. So they pushed forward this pre-existing proposal of a science assessment process and setting up a new institution with the full expectation that if you put a bunch of scientists together, they will never agree on anything, they will simply argue. And so the US government and others were very surprised when the first report came out in 1990 with a very firm consensus that climate change was a problem that we knew enough about, basically, to start dealing with. I mean, that's not what the report said, but that's what any rational person would conclude. And I've been an author on one type or another. There are 3 or 4 different kinds of authors since the first one.
So what, I know I think I've quoted you on .earth about this before, this question of like, has the IPCC done its job, the IPCC, and or is there a new model for it? And finally, how would that actually happen? You know enough about the mechanics of the IPCC. This is a question I've asked people, is if you wanted to change it, to make it a more agile, responsive, transparent system, how would that happen?
First of all the things you just said are, yes, that's the direction we need to go in. Right now it is too big, too ponderous, too opaque. So how would you do it?
Right.
Slowly. It's not going to happen. It will take many years. And part of the reason is that ultimately the governments are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And if something is there and doing some function and not causing any trouble for them, they don't like to mess with it because they're inherently conservative. Now, that being said, IPCC has done a terrific job. It's not matched well to the evolving world, but it did what it was set up to do. It formed a sort of one-stop shopping place where the governments could go, get a reliable judgment on what the science said, so they didn't have to squabble among themselves about what the science says, and then they could move forward and develop policies. Of course, the latter hasn't happened so effectively, but it did what it was set up to do. It's just a little ill-matched for this more quick-moving world, a world where everything is over in 10 seconds. Everybody wants to see everything that's happening, and IPCC is not. It's been too opaque, and it's been too slow. It's yesterday's news by the time it gets out, and many of us want to change that.
Well, I must say that the one you were very involved with, a special report on extremes, I thought was incredibly valuable, but it was what made that different?
Well, first of all, the IPCC, there are 2 kinds of reports. One occurs, full assessments of everything you always wanted to know about climate change. They're published every 6 to 7 years. In the interim between those big reports, it's supposed to be small reports that focus on particular problems. Over time, the balance has shifted, so IPCC seems to spend too much time on the big reports, not enough time on the smaller reports, which are really could be focused on things policymakers care about today. How do people react in disasters? What do we do about it? Is sea level rising much faster than we previously expected? What do we think is going to happen over the next 20 or 30 years? How does storm risk change? How does flood risk change? What should we be doing about it right now? Those are questions that policymakers think about day in and day out. They are less interested in having IPCC repeat the wheel on what greenhouse gases do, how strong they are. Things are already more or less understood. And IPCC kind of can't quite get itself over to that new world. But this report that I was involved in is a good example of what could be done. It was very useful for people, particularly in developing countries.
One frustration I've had with the IPCC process is I don't think it's done a good enough job on delineating areas of science where basically they become known unknowns.
Yeah.
Like sensitivity, the sensitivity of the climate system to a doubling of CO2 is basically the same range as it was for Jules Turney in 1979. And I keep saying, well, in 5 more years, give us, you get into this sort of, oh, we'll get that for you better. Regional climate forecasting. Gavin Schmidt at NASA's Goddard Institute told me years ago, you could give us billions of dollars more computer power, but regional climate change forecasting is not something we're going to do better. But I don't see the process as being very good at delineating those kinds of things.
So the first thing you said is right, namely the known unknowns. IPCC, this is a weak point for IPCC. For instance, we know that the ice sheets are deteriorating. We know that they can contribute many meters to sea level rise, but we don't know how fast that could happen. The research is in a situation where we're discovering new things all the time. IPCC doesn't know how to handle a problem that you can't do a quantitative projection on. IPCC is uncomfortable getting experts to sit down and talk about risks in a more qualitative way, but that's the way it has to be talked about in these known unknown parts of the problem. The one thing they have done right, though, is the climate sensitivity part. They brought everything to bear that they could to try to say as much as reasonably possible. I think it's actually been done well. And it isn't quite true. I know everybody says it, that the same numbers were out there in 1979 and the 1.5 to 4.5 degrees, and we don't know anymore. That isn't true, because when the 1.5 to 4.5 degrees was first proposed, there was very little confidence in either the 1.5 or the 4.5 degrees. The confidence levels have gone up. So that even if the range hasn't changed, there's a sense in which we know a hell of a lot more.
Which theoretically can help you shape the policy response.
It should. Yes. Theoretically, if we had people who wanted to shape a good policy response.
Right.
There are some.
So maybe we should talk about the policy arena. I assume, I didn't do deep homework in the sense of, have you done congressional testimony? You must have done something. A lot. Right, what you mentioned earlier on acid rain.
Many dozen times.
Yeah, so this issue has gotten very heated up recently in terms of people like Willie Soon or others who have some connection to the fossil fuel industry, or on the other side, perhaps to an advocacy group. What's your lessons learned in the policy arena, in that, maybe particularly in the congressional arena?
With regard to it, narrow it down a little for me.
Well,
I learned a lot of lessons.
To me, it's
many of which I'd like to forget. But
well, maybe we're going to agree on this too. To me, it's all theater. You can find someone. So if you're on whatever your position on the ideological spectrum, you can roll out several different PhD scientists, probably with publishing records to make your point.
It is rare that testimony is anything but theater. On the other hand, I've seen a few times, I've been part of panels a few times, testifying before Congress where it made a significant difference, mostly with the problem of ozone depletion, where the problem was too imminent, too serious. Stuff was happening right then that was shocking people, like the ozone hole. And people were, our leaders were really open to try to use science to figure out what was going on. So scientists would get up and testify about something, and it would have an immediate impact on those listening. I think that it's not quite true about the climate problem. People are more dug in with particular perspectives. You go up there, you say what you honestly think the truth is, as I do, and you're either going to be listened to or not listened to, depending on the policy implications of it, or not depending on what the actual information is. That's sad.
But
that's gotten worse.
Let's talk about your background in terms of being at EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, early on, and then still continuing to publish as a scientist, and perhaps here in congressional testimony. This gets to that question of advocacy. What drew you into that arena? And then I assume it comes with pluses and minuses, or maybe not.
Well, I can't really give you, I seriously try to look at, I thought about this many times. I've never had a minus from having spent some of my career as an advocate. I never got, I've been attacked plenty, but we all are. And I've been attacked for things that were silly and irrelevant. And people who disagree with me, you'll find it on the web. If you look it up, they'll say things about, I worked for EDF, but then there's nothing that follows from that. Or Barbara Streisand, once gave EDF a few $100,000 to support my work. And then it's like, so what? So in where it counts, which is the people who use the information that I try to purvey, or my colleagues, have they ever sort of held it against me or discounted what I say because I work for EDF? The answer is no, as far as I can tell. And if anything, they seem to regard the fact that I had some real world experience with an advocacy group as a plus. But there's a reason for that. I worked very hard, day and night, never to make a mistake. And I'm sure I made mistakes. But the one nightmare I always had was I was going to get up, say something to the press, say something in testimony, and it would be shown to be wrong. Because I knew if I did, immediately it would be jumped on. So I got in the habit of not being conservative, but being careful. And I don't say that I've never been caught out, but it's very hard to catch me saying something that's wrong, because I don't.
Yeah. That gets at the press, so we should
Yes, let's talk about the press.
Yeah.
Andy, what kind of job do you think the press has done on this issue?
Well, there's several different layers to that question. One is how you define news. And given the strictures of how a newspaper or TV broadcast, as we know it, works, I think that the press has done a really reasonably good job of finding ways over the years to get this issue onto screens and into newspapers, at least like the New York Times. But that's the New York Times and that's CBS News or whatever. That's not mainstream American press. The strictures, again, are the thing that make an issue like this, or Medicare insolvency, or Social Security debt, national debt. I mean, there are other issues that have the same shape of this one. They're looming. There's embedded uncertainty. There's ideological divisions over how you even deal with it that are not climate change and that get short shrift. So it's the nature of the issue that keeps it from getting.
Let me press you on that.
Do press me, yeah.
My observation is that, let's take the Times.
Yeah.
Unless you don't want to talk about it.
Of course not. I'd love to talk about it.
Okay. My observation has been the interest in doing climate change related stories is varied at the Times all the time. And there were times, I'm sorry if I have to use the word again, when the editors were positively dismissive.
Yeah.
And there were other times when they were very welcoming and encouraging, as they seem to be now. Is that consistent with what you know? And if so,
yes.
How does one, how do these changes happen? That they go to a cocktail party and happen to run into somebody they respect, who's, Al Gore or somebody that you better pay attention to this? What happens?
That's a very good question, but I'll give you an example of what can happen. In 2003, that was the year I went to the North Pole. We had a package in the works of stories about every facet of the climate change problem that was going to get written. But there was a change of the guard. That was the Jason Blair fiasco. So the Uber editor who had commissioned this package was out. And Bill Keller and Jill Abramson were in. And there was a perception I wasn't directly involved in hearing this, so I don't want to be too precise, but that it was wonky. It was someday. It was an awful lot about something pretty complicated to do so many stories, and the package went away. Didn't happen. So that dynamic is real, and it just relates to and some editors are more weaned on politics. Much of our coverage, I thought, of the climate bill, the whole run-up to the climate bill in the 2000s, was too focused on it like a sporting event because it was done by political reporters. It was not about actually if you wanted to stop climate change, what could you do legislatively? and is this the right tool? It was more like the Republicans are doing this
Well,
strategy.
but the media are always more interested in the game than the facts.
I know,
That's
I know.
true across issues.
But that's what I'm saying. There is a problem. I mean, there's a problem.
That's a problem.
And so at the Times, you know, we did what we could as reporters, and science editor Corey Dean and others since her, and actually before, you know, the Times in 1956, the year of my birth, there was a really good article about greenhouse-driven global warming in the New York Times. So it's not like it hasn't been there. Should there be more? Well, this gets to the Green blog was killed off, and 2000. It started in 2009 and ended whenever, several years ago. The problem there is, and I've heard this about BBC from someone at the BBC, that you can generate more and more stuff, but if people aren't watching it or reading it, then that's not solving the problem either. What happened with that blog was partially administrative. They had no budget, and there were two editors whose positions really could have been used more cost effectively in the newsroom doing that green stuff. And but it also was the fact that it wasn't read. It was there for the microscopically small group of us who care about this issue. So that, and at BBC, I've heard the same thing. They produce a lot of stuff, but the viewership isn't there. And then, what does that mean?
Well, see, there's a chicken egg problem there. For most of the decades that this was an issue, since it grew into a public issue sometime in the 1980s, the media interest has waxed and waned.
Yeah.
And the trouble is the media, I don't think, have tried, with rare exception, to sort of be the engine that drives an issue like they are with some other issues. They just decide they're going to do it. And, you know, come hell or high water, and it wouldn't matter for some period of time.
The Guardian is doing that right now.
Yeah, the Guardian is doing that. And I think there's been less of that on this issue than many other issues, which are less important. And the reason has to do with the complexity of it, I think. And an editor, there was a period in the 1980s when I could get almost any op-ed that I wrote onto the op-ed page. It was a very sweet time for me.
Yeah.
It didn't last long. But during that period, I got one in, and the editor of the op-ed page turned it over to a deputy editor to edit to final form. And he started talking to me about this, and he just out of nowhere said, "Pardon me, but you know, I think the environment is dull as dishwater." For no reason. It was like a gratuitous insult. I think that reflected a lot of the attitude in the media for a long time. I think things have changed. I think there's some competition over this issue now. I think we're in a better space. Not perfect by a long way.
I want to shift to maybe a first round of questions from the audience, including the online audience. And I know Bob Rule, I got to ask you, because what we were just talking about is very germane. Bob Rule is B-R-U-L-L-E, is a Drexel University sociologist. And I was very happy to hear he was coming. So Bob, do you have a question about this nexus of cart and horse and media coverage and issue?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess my question would be,
And I'm going to repeat it because we don't have a roving mic.
nobody's ever had a problem hearing me.
But the online people do.
Well, I'll just shout. No, but, well, my question here is that, as Mike was saying, is that the media is driven by audience reception. Who said if you can't sell it, you can't publish it. I mean, and what you've seen in the media is basically a collapse of sort of the number of outlets. And if you're trying to be a freelancer now, you're going to work for $10 or $12 an hour if you're lucky. And so you end up with this episodic media coverage based mostly on whether the politicians happen to be talking about it. Science has no effect in a lot of ways. I mean, we've started that. We know it doesn't have any correlation. I guess my question is that we now have this media-driven, I mean, this monopolized public space with a few outlets that they all have to compete for views. And now we have this sort of the imposition of on the media model notion of sponsored content, where we're now basically people pay to have their stories shown. And so you end up with, how can you have decent, balanced media coverage of a long-term issue like this when you have a short-term profit incentive and sponsored content. And my other question, I guess this is my question for you, is what effect does advertisers have on content? Is the fact that MSNBC is brought to you by the American Petroleum Institute every night, which if you turn it on, you'll see American Natural Gas, API, BP. What effect does that have on content?
So,
For me, that's a.
let me try to summarize it for the online viewership. There are two issues that Bob Rule identified. One is increasingly in the media landscape, we have this sponsored content essentially is driving what you see in this overall landscape of stuff. And then you have, God, I'm blanking my brain.
I guess just the sort of the problem of trying to get readership.
Right.
And the short term, you basically have to entertain people to get them to read the stuff. And it's not entertaining, but it's important. Yeah,
well, this is a big, I teach a course in blogging. The other problem he articulated was about, again, sort of, if your income that you get as a news outlet is coming from petroleum companies or the new gas, blah, blah, what kind of effect that has. Just from personal experience, I will say, I've said this many times, I've never, ever, no one ever at the New York Times pressured me in one way or the other to not cover something because of something related to the finances of the paper. Sometimes they're just budget limits, but I got to go to the North Pole, even and to other places like that. But the paid content thing is something I have seen. Like the New York Times does special sections. They're profitable. They've done them on cars or on whatever. I have not yet to see a special section on poverty. In other words, there's a certain number of pages per year that are devoted to stuff like that, but not to stuff that might matter more to society. So there are issues that are emerging. I'm not sure they're new. They're not new. The pressure thing, maybe at other outlets it's happened, but I've never seen it at the Times. I don't know.
I think we should ask some other people.
Yeah, now are there any other questions out here? Dick?
I don't think the New York Times is where it's at.
Dick doesn't think the New York Times is where it's at. I'm just repeating.
We're talking to ourselves, professors and people who are really involved in science or social issues, but we aren't reaching at all the average guy. And so you end up with Republicans in Congress, more than half of them, saying that they don't believe that the science is true. We need to find different ways, it seems to me, to reach the people. I think your reference to the social media may be a better thing. The only time I saw this issue really become aware to the public at large was with Al Gore's The Inconvenient Truth, the movie.
Right.
I don't know if you can do that once a month.
Yeah, so let me address it.
Repeat the question.
The question is, this issue seems to be one that circulates and is a great concern among the elites, so to speak, but doesn't reach the average person. So that's part of the unfortunate structural problem with the issue. It's not happening in everybody's lives and it's happening, but people can't see it mostly in their own lives right now. So it's hard for them to want to focus on it when there's so much other complicated and fundamentally disturbing and pessimism generating stuff going on in both the world at large and in their own lives. And I think that that's a structural problem that we all have to get used to, because I don't see it going away until things get so bad in the climate sense that it's just sort of inevitable. Even a Hurricane Sandy, say, which had some quantitative relationship to climate change for the sea level rise, enhancement of the flooding, for instance, and at least as an analog, it's gone. And that was 2.5 years ago, and people largely forget about it unless their house burned down during the hurricane. And you don't want stuff like that to be happening so often that people remember. That's why I titled my first book, The Race Against the Greenhouse Effect. It is a race, because by the time we get to the point where everybody grasps it in that tangible way they do other issues like healthcare, it's not too late. It can always get worse, but it's very, very late. So the question is, how do you have a situation where people who need to get access to the information in order to make informed decisions as citizens can? There is no easy answer to that. I think that, from what I can tell, people, what the surveys seem to show is there's at least name recognition. People understand there's a problem. People are willing to countenance solutions to the problem. People are willing to pay something, but it still ranks rather low in terms of overall concerns. I don't have a ready answer. I mean, I'm doing what I can do as a scientist, but that doesn't solve it.
Here, and then Melanie over here, and then back over here.
So I'm interested that after all these years, climate change coverage is still kind of in the environmental section of the press. Because climate change obviously affects all of our society, specifically with comments from the administration about climate change as a national security issue. It never seems to go beyond one press cycle, and I'd be really interested to know why you think journalists don't necessarily get to cover climate change as a national security problem.
The question was why does it end up always sort of niched as an environmental question, even when it has ramifications for national security in the case of this question, certainly in many other arenas as well.
Yeah, so look, the biggest thing that happened for the climate issue in recent times, and which goes to this question about the average person getting it, is that the president decided to take it up and campaign on it. And this, even in the days when Clinton was president and Gore was vice president, their focus on the climate issue was like 2 days at a time around Kyoto, and then they were gone. This is not a criticism of them per se, but I'm just saying it wasn't nearly enough. When Obama decided about, a year or two ago that this was part of his legacy in the second term, he did this thing for weeks at a time. And they figured out ways to mobilize the government as a whole. So there would be a speech. Then there would be an announcement by some part of the government of some climate-related program they're doing. Then the next day there would be something introduced that would relate to something related to the budget or to Congress or some department that you don't think of as having anything to do with climate change. This was a real public campaign, and it made a difference. As far as I can tell, maybe Bob has a different view. It did push the surveys, not permanently, but this is what you have to do with an issue. You have to have a leader, and that's the ultimate solution to the problem, who's going to really hold it close and talk about it all the time. And the net effect of that is he prepared the ground so we would have some public policy. We have regulations now. There are going to be more. If the Supreme Court lets them stand, there are going to be more after that. That's what informing the public really is related to. That's how to do it. And there's a positive result from it.
And that generates press too.
That generates the press.
Melanie.
So one of the places where I learned about how people talk about climate change is on your social media site. And a couple days ago, you posted college-educated Republicans most skeptical of global warming. And it's kind of an interesting counterpart to the idea that the average person is the problem in terms of access to these ideas. Because if college-educated Republicans who in this poll were actually much more likely to think that climate change was exaggerated than even high school graduates. It makes a difference in terms of how the media is going to talk about this.
Well, yeah, it was when I started. I spent the first 20 years writing about global warming, right up until like 2006, as kind of a science problem. It was biogeophysical stuff with some technology questions attached. And then because the issue heated up right around then with Al Gore's movie and other things, I started looking That's when I first started interviewing people like Bob Brule, sociologists and psychologists, about the inconvenient mind aspect of this, not just the inconvenient truth, but that we're set up in so many ways such that information on its own doesn't change things. That was an existential question for me as a journalist. I was halfway through my career. It's one reason I've been reflecting on it. One reason I came to PACE to teach and be effective in academia. That's kind of a joke for academics. Is I got convinced that the next 20 years just communicating based on that kind of reality, where more information reinforces people in their silos, made me convinced I needed to look at this whole landscape of ideas and responses much more closely.
So the theory, such as it is on that kind of a reaction, is that if you, that basically facts don't matter, or you reorganize facts to be consistent with a pre-existing worldview. That's an extreme position. It doesn't characterize everybody, but there is now a common view in social psychology that that's part of the problem in trying to penetrate. So in this case, and I'm extrapolating here, what presumably happens is people, and I think Dan Gahan at Yale was the one I heard this part of the theory from, that if you're smart enough to have a college degree, assuming that's an indication of smarts, which I'm not always sure of, but let's say it is, that you think you can in your mind construct arguments which can knock down anything if you're willing to filter your facts. So it's much easier for you to take stuff that experts feed you and deny the parts you don't like and accept the parts you do like and reshape them according to your worldview. And that might be what's happening in that case.
I just want to be sure I didn't miss someone who was over there. Are you and then the young man there?
I think it's more it's more widespread than you imagine, and I'll tell you why. Went to have my hair cut, and talking to people who are basically kind of they're not following. They may not even be reading the New York Times. But we got into climate change. That was the topic. That was the topic. And the lovely woman who cuts my hair, who has a high school education, said, well, Al Gore was right. And I think people are looking for leadership. And what's happening then is someone like the Tea Party congressperson, they have an enormous effect because they are constantly out there. They have free access by publishing in small papers all over their districts, and they say it's like what Michael was just saying. They cherry pick things, and what they say then goes out, and it is not opposed. The congressman I'm thinking of is out there every single week saying basically lying, but the Democratic Party has rolled over. There's nothing at all in the paper that is the opposing voice. So that is something that we all need to be aware of and try to do something.
Okay. Here, and then way in the back.
Just a couple of things is that, like what we heard from another guy here is that what's it with me have to do with Republicans not paying attention to these sciences? What is happening?
Wait, say that again.
I remember someone saying that Republicans, a lot of them in Congress, not really like paying attention to these sciences. Like, what does this have to do?
So, I mean, there still is a period where on a whole series of issues, Republicans in Congress saw it as an advantage to deny what most scientists thought. It wasn't just climate change. And I think that at the base of it has to do with, you need scientific facts to shape regulations. And if you don't like the idea of regulating, an easy way to get around it is to attack the science. But the Republicans seem to have started to realize that that wasn't such a good strategy. And so they shifted gears. And about 6 months ago, the line became, I'm not a scientist, don't ask me, which was stupidest excuse I could ever hear, and basically relinquishing what they were elected for, which is to sort facts out and make judgments. So I think the Republican Party at that level is in flux. I hope they won't wind up just treading water on this. Hopefully they'll come over with a more sensible way to approach the facts. And, you know, this will turn out to have been a bad dream, basically, but I can't guarantee that that's what's going to happen.
Wait against the wall in the back, and then this one here.
This is for you, Dr. Oppenheimer, specifically. Don't mind another point of question. What would you feel, or whom do you feel, or what do you think is the largest obstacle we need to overcome to adequately get on track and address climate change as a whole?
First of all, I don't want to leave the impression that climate change isn't starting to be addressed. We've had some fundamental changes happening, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere in the last couple of years. Again, the program that the Obama administration decided to press forward through executive power is basically a revolution. It's a small step in some regards, but from the U.S. government point of view, it's the first time a serious effort has really been begun. The discussion between the U.S. and China that resulted in commitments from the Chinese and from the U.S. to make serious cuts in the period beyond 2020 is a very, very big and important step forward. The EU's emissions are down and they're going to go further down. So between the EU, the US, and China, you have 55% of global emissions. So think that, you know, slowly, painfully slowly, countries are stepping up to the bar, actually doing what they should be doing. I personally, going back to the comment I made earlier, given the difficulty of the average person putting this problem front and center and their concerns, and I completely understand that. And if I didn't work on this full time, I don't know if I would put it as the #1 problem I was focusing on. You know, the most important thing is political leadership. And when you've got it, it goes a long way to solving problems like this. And when you haven't gotten it, you just either treading water or going backward.
A woman right here.
I guess I wanted to just ask a couple, to press a little further on structural changes and leadership. First, to connect that to the media a little bit more, because it seems like what we say over here is that more could be done, that we could expect more. I mean, I wonder, what if the New York Times and the Washington Post had a column? One column on the front page is always about the climate, because there's a foreign policy column, and that's just the way it is now. There's, you know, the front page is organized in a certain way, and isn't there that a matter of leadership in a certain way? If the people who are in institutional positions of authority make this a priority and need to devote a certain amount of space and time to it, you can sacrifice a certain amount of, you know, immediate readership, but that's going to percolate down into the broadcast news and other things. And changes like that could make a big difference. And I wonder about the feasibility of something like changes made at the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, right? I mean, there's things about talk radio didn't used to be the way talk radio was, or the abolishment of the fairness doctrine. And so it seems like there's a lot of things that could be done structurally, and just how much time we spend paying attention to things would mean something.
Well, there are all kinds of structural impediments to change that usually persist because they have broader constituencies than just around this issue of climate change. Just on things like the fairness doctrine and the 60-vote supermajority in the Senate, they tend to be things that Republicans and Democrats in some way or other want to sustain, because when the power base is flipped the other way, you can't hear me. When the 60-vote supermajority seems terrible now, but there are times when it served the purpose of progressives in different ways. So you end up with everyone kind of trying to sustain these mechanisms that are not great. On the media thing, the Guardian is the experiment. Let's see what happens. I don't think it'll be viral in the sense it's going to spring to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other papers magically. I think a lot of us have done this. You know, this is not new. The New York Times, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't count up how many series I've been involved with, special reports that we did on climate change in the time that I had that beat. Climate Divide, the Energy Challenge, which was 2 years of very specific stories about the energy challenge and climate context. But we can't force people to read them. You know, they're there. They were front page, most of them, but it has to be the readership interest too. And you can only make some of these stories interesting to a certain extent. And that editor who killed that series in 2003 was right. It is complicated and it is wonky and it is someday. So that's, you know, those are realities too. And that gets to education. There was a question on Twitter about education and what can we do from the bottom up through the science standards. I think you're seeing some progress actually, even in some states that were resistant to, you know, had all these problems with how to treat climate in education. There are prospects for making a change there. Decharging the issue so it becomes teachable is a really important thing. Making it less polarized and more about what's climate, what's weather, and what have you learned. And you know, one of the things I think scientists could do better is to be available to their communities, to be there. And there are plenty who do this. I might be sitting here now. But so that people becomes demystified that science is a journey, that actually argument is a normal part of science. One of the things I've seen for so many years is you get this, people say, well, they disagree, therefore we don't know anything, therefore we don't have to do anything. But scientists, they're going to disagree on sea ice till the end of the earth. Because those science questions are, what we know is delineated through argument in science. That's how science works. So the more people know about the process of science, the better I think we'd be off. The better off we'd be as a society.
Let me just add that I'm not one who believes in solving all the big structural problems in order to get at a problem like climate change, because you'll be here in 50 years still trying to solve all that other stuff.
You're rolling in.
And you know, there are a lot of people who thought for a long time, you're not going to solve the climate problem unless you renovate Western civilization so it's not consumerist oriented. Okay, but by that time the temperature will be 25 degrees warmer and we're all dead. So I don't have the patience for that. I want to deal with the climate problem where I can deal with it and get some really constructive things done, show that things can be done. It doesn't bankrupt the economy. We can move ahead. And we live in a period when maybe that's starting to happen. Could all be reversed depending on who the next president is, but you know.
In the back, and then the man there, and then the mom.
Thank you. Just because everybody seems to be bringing this up, I just have a comment on something that everybody's addressing and then a question. As far as getting fearful that, like, let's say, for instance, U.S. citizens, they've polled consistently U.S. citizens, or people that, including people that don't vote and people that vote, and consistently, whether it be red or blue states, they're finding that the majority of citizens, as much as about 49, 50% to 60 or 70% in certain areas, all agree even environmental for jobs. So the polarization is more in the government than it is in the actual people of the country. I think a lot of people actually, on a, you know, to be positive, have actually do want something to happen. They're just not getting it from the political establishment. My actual question is, and it's the both if you don't mind, and it's funny, you just touched on it, can we really have a serious conversation about climate change without having a serious conversation about our economic system? And that even people that used to push for capitalism now are saying it's unsustainable as it is now. And this is all over the spectrum, all different people with all different varied degrees saying that, or at least our current structure of capitalist economy is just not sustainable. Can we address climate change without having an honest conversation about economics? I guess is my question.
Yes, I think we can. And I think, I'm not saying you should put away those other issues. You just can't wait for the world to change in the larger sense before you try to fix the climate problems. The other issues are serious, but they're not going to be fixed overnight either. So.
And just quickly on that, you know, one thing about the Guardian series that troubles me, although it's very much a British press cultural thing, is they let off their series, their thing with Naomi Klein, who wants to end capitalism to solve the climate problem. That was on the front page in news space. In the U.S. tradition of the press, that's not only a non-starter, but it's guaranteed to ruin your credibility going forward. And they're getting some heat for the way they're pursuing this. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's a very different cultural tradition in the press in England and Europe, where you're mixing in editorializing and news, but it can lead to some really big questions in the news process. I just want to keep the questions rolling. So,
yes, follow up to the other question here. There's a substantial, gradual, growing movement in the financial markets on a global basis focusing on climate change and other issues of this nature. And there's a fair amount of press about that. So from the scientific and the journalistic perspective, what are your opinions about how that is being put out to investors, to the public, and to the political arena for policy?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. There's been a group called Ceres, which has been at work for a long time trying to get investors to focus on the inherent risks that companies are ignoring by ignoring climate change. How carbon intensive are they? What kind of commitment do they have that they're going to have to unwind over time? And therefore, what are we not paying attention to when we invest in stocks of a company like, name one, Exxon, I don't care. So I think it's a bit of still a niche, but they've gotten a lot of attention. I think it has forced many companies to start thinking about looking internally and thinking about what the prospects in the future are over a course of 10 or 20 years and how that affects their business model. So that's certainly starting. I don't know that it's affected any company in any significant way yet, but it's part of a sort of a reframing of the way, as you said, a couple of people said, institutions think about the problem. And if there's progress on that regard, it will make it easier to start implementing policies that actually do something about the problem. But again, I wouldn't wait to restructure corporations on the whole before I got on finding other ways to solve the problem.
And in the investment arena, as a journalist, I've been very wary. Journalists are fundamentally skeptical, and the greenwashing reality is out there. And there are some hidden issues that people don't always think about. Even in the divestment discussion, which is a very valuable discussion to have. I tweeted the other day that maybe I don't see JP Morgan, the bank, on people's divestment lists, even though I had seen in banktrack.org is very interesting. It's sort of a transparency portal for tracking where money is going. And the boom in financing, bank money going to get more fossil fuels out of the ground is like zoom, like this. So, Exxon, shame on blah, blah, blah. If you're not focusing on where the money is going, you're missing. This gets to the reality that a big chunk of our economy and our investment world is invested in things that relate to fossil fuels. So I think that's why I think that the investment discussions is valuable, because it can get you starting to think, well, wow, I'm actually invested. I live in an old house that burns too much oil, and we just moved into it. I'm determined to cut my investment in the fossil fuel industry as much as I can by cutting that. But so the more we think about that, the better off we are. Although, again, in that arena, I see lots of things that worry me sometimes. Just bubbles and that kind of thing. You had a question, and then I'll try to focus on the side of the room.
This isn't entirely related to climate change science-based, but because I feel that we all have been kind of talking to the choir for so many years, people who read, and are not just the elite, people who read your column, people who are looking for policy-driven changes, are not always elite. There are people who are educated or not educated, but know that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. With the Pope's encyclical coming up, that's likely to kind of pop up other faith-based statements on environment. There's an opportunity here to possibly have a little bit of a shift in a tipping point from just people who already know this stuff looking for more information about it to the average guy, average families beginning to hear from a faith-based point of view that these issues matter. And how are we going to meet this opportunity with some real impact? Because we may not get this, it'll have its 15 minutes of fame, the encyclical will, just like everything else has. So how do we meet this with as much impetus as we can to make something come of it other than congregants being scared out of their minds?
What people are thinking about, serious people who understand that opening. This has to do with the Pope's encyclical on, it's going to address climate change, certainly. And there are people thinking about how to take advantage of that. So, I'm not, I've heard these discussions, but I'm not central to it. It's not my expertise. But, there have been lots of efforts over time to engage between the faith community and the scientific community And there has been some positive progress out of that, but it's complicated. I'm not an expert on it, so that's all I'm going to say, except I think those efforts are worth the effort.
Well, I was at this, I was privileged to be at this meeting at the Vatican last year for 4 days. There was a prelude, basically building an information base that will go into the Pope's encyclical. It's the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences had this meeting. I was there just because I've been dug in on this stuff for so long, mostly scientists and economists. And what was invaluable, it got back to the whole thing we just started with here and having the merging of the PACES initiatives related to philosophy and the environment and science and the environment. You need them all in the room. That there are moral questions that actually are far more profound than the scientific ones. And some of them are about energy, the impacts of energy, the hidden ones, and the values of energy, the energy poverty issue that Ban Ki-moon has been so great about highlighting sustainable energy for all. We need energy, the world needs more energy, and some of us need to think about where we get it from. So you have the splitting off those questions, making sure that you understand when the question is one that's moral and when the question is one that's technical. That if your opposition to something is based on your values or based on science, the more of that, the better. And so I think that's the thing that they bring. And by the way, the other thing, the Pope's people are so cool. There was I can't remember his name. There was an archbishop from South America who gave the opening speech, and he said, they bring a whole new level to this question. Climate change is a symptom of a much more profound thing that's happening on planet Earth. It's a coming of age of a species that's very young and very kind of, as I've put it for many years, in puberty. And we haven't really grown up yet. And he said in his speech, man is a technical giant, but an ethical child. We don't know how to use these tools yet. And I think that's another layer that has to be part of this as well, which gets back to the finger pointing that we do so often on these issues, I think hides that we all have some things to grapple with here. It's not just fossil fuel companies. We buy the fossil fuels. They wouldn't be rich if it weren't for us. It's bigger than that. I'm not saying those problems don't exist. Disinformation, too much power in Washington. But this is bigger than that. And so having that really wide perspective is really important. Right over here, and then a little bit further. You can combine your questions or something.
It's more of a comment.
Sure.
So first off, a lot of what we're talking about on a personal sense resonates huge because this is my whole life's work is deciding, figuring out how we're going to relate the overall picture of environmentalism mostly. And I personally think pop culture is more than social media. I appreciate the fact that we're finally speaking about how we need a leader in the sense of packaging it up and selling it. And I know that sounds bad as environmentalists, as we don't like commodity and all that, but at the end of the day, that's what this world is based upon. So we need to play the game rather than trying to beat the game. Obama is the president of the United States, and the government is so complicated as its inner workings and everything. But we have Obama to say, I understand it because there's a president. So I truly believe that in the pop culture sense, we need someone that's going to represent that and show people that they don't need to be complete environmentalists to change the world. You can make 5% of change, and 500,000 people changing 5% is going to make an overall difference. And I think that's one of the most important things that we need to focus on right now too.
The question was about, the comment was about the value of pop culture and having little incremental influences can be a valuable thing, and I agree with you. There are people in the pop culture world who are entering into this arena.
Yeah, I mean, there have been for a long period of time, and they serve a function. You can't get too carried away by, sometimes they don't always say it right.
Well, I have a personal ambition that I'm not going to get into when it comes to that.
But, I think on the whole, and recognizing there are people from the pop culture that are going to be on the other side.
Right.
I think that it's a constructive thing. This can't be a thing just for the elites, or else nothing's ever going to get done.
You have a comment?
I just want to say
We
that
should
I
be good,
think
Mike.
media has a role to play, as does science and as business, but we are kind of shortchanging the importance of education and our educational institutions as part of the solution. And I think we've waited too long before we can kind of turn the light on. What is it that we can be doing to prepare the next generation of consumers, business leaders, politicians, policymakers, so that we can rapidly change this fact? And I don't think we've been given the facts, but we haven't been given a roadmap.
Yeah.
And I think I want to see a little bit more of that in the media and elsewhere. So what are your thoughts about
The question was about the role of education, and particularly trying to develop a roadmap or sort of actionable ways to build from the education arena out to impact. I hope you don't mind. This is one of the things I've been very passionate about. Last year, a year and a half ago, I gave a speech about, I said, like, if there was one thing we could do to make some kind of a difference in this area, it would be to develop a field trip, an annual field trip for every school in America. Doesn't require a budget. You don't even need a bus. You don't need permission slips. The field trip is to the boiler room in your school. And so I gave this talk. I think I tweeted about it. And then a woman who works for Solar One, which is a nonprofit here in New York City that does curriculum development for energy, said, we do that. And I went on one of these at the Bronx High School of Energy and Technology and Energy, and it was so mind-blowingly cool. The custodian gives the lecture, and he shows them the little, you can peek into the furnace, and he shows them how you have to open these vents to get more oxygen in there, so the combustion of the fuel. He talks about the oil budget, and you know, it shows you your school is a system. It's not just a place to learn. We should do that in this very building every year, maybe on Earth Day. So we get a sense of system thinking about the things we take for granted, like energy. Where does that actually come from? And it was so exciting. And so I tried to promote it on .earth. I haven't done enough, actually. I should write something bigger about it. So there are models like that, and they're really, when you see them, you go, oh, yeah. But we need to, that's, I mean, as a communicator, that's what I try to do. You know, I'm trying to make sure the right idea gets to the right place at the right time. That's the value of communication in all this. I don't know if you've seen things like that just kind of make you go, yes.
Yeah, every once in a while, though, it's gotten that in my head. But I have to, just my impression as someone who is an educator, and although, you know, my slice of it occurs at a sort of fairly elite level, there's no question in my mind that the amount of engagement that students have in not just the issue and awareness, but wanting to do something about it, has increased tremendously over the 13 years that I've been back at a university. Again, this may not be typical, but I hear the same stories from my colleagues around the country. The other thing I noticed, I have two kids, and one of them is still fairly young. He's in high school. And I try not to bring my work home. That's one way I depersonalize it. I don't talk about it at home. And, you know, if they want to ask me a question, but they almost never do, because like,
Same with me.
yeah, it's like, go away. And yet, if I listen to what he talks about with his friends and what he knows about, it's like revolutionary compared to the generation before. It's sort of in the air with a lot of these kids. So that's a part. Yeah, we could do better. Yes, we need to do better. Yeah, we have to find ways to get the message out. But it's already just so many notches above where it used to be.
Andy, how about one more question?
Oh, gosh. That one
You had been waiting for a long time.
Yes, thank you. No, I have a question that sort of builds on the last comment and question, which is, I was wondering, what can art, and not just film, obviously, but visual artists, do to activate an educational platform or collaborate with scientists to help, disseminate this message about climate change and make it more personal and more accessible on an individual level? Because I think that that's the untapped resource that's out there that science steps a lot of the structural problems that are happening right now.
I mean, there are continuing collaborations. The one that's in my mind is a photographer who has done a lot with regard to the ice situation, and I've seen several. I can't remember.
Jim Palin.
Yeah, and just it's nothing you can go out. As a scientist, you can't go out and make somebody do that. But we have to remain accessible to them, so that when they they want to express what we're saying, that we're willing to help them. And there is a lot of that goes on. And you can't. There is no formula for assuring some kind of uptake by the creative world, by the things that go on in the scientific world or the policy world. But I think it's incumbent upon experts to try to be accessible, because it's another one of these ways to get the message out that we just can't do ourselves.
Well, and I'm passionate about this. If you
The time when I saw the most news stories about global warming in one place at one time was actually on a trip to Bangladesh a long time ago. This was back in the late 1980s. And because they had the sea level rise problem staring them right in the face, they, at least the English language papers, it was tricky because I don't know what was going on in the papers that warranted them. But in that day and in those papers, there was a story every single day about climate change, about sea level rise, and about what needed to be done in that country. And although that country is in desperate shape, what they have managed to do is cut the death rate in cyclones from an estimated million a cyclone in 1970, when there was a really bad storm and a bad situation with it. We're on the verge of, or just over the civil war where they separated from West Pakistan. They've now gone ahead and done some of the simple things that can be done to defend themselves, like building concrete bunkers and developing early warning systems. The early warning systems give the warning. The concrete bunkers are the place to go. They're not expensive, so they haven't given up. They can't do much about emissions because they don't have much emissions, but they can do something about the threat as they perceive it. Now, you can take that to mean we're sunk because we're not going to do anything until we're staring this in the face, or you can take it as a message that even people who you think have much greater concern than their lives, and a lot of them are not literate even, are concerned enough about this problem so they'll get up and be active and do something about it. What they needed to get that done was a functional government, which they didn't have a long time ago, and now they sort of have. You can take what you want from that. I take it as somewhat inspiring.
And by the way, there's one last thing I want to say about this, which is you look at someone like Michael Oppenheimer, look at someone like Bill McKibben, and you throw me into the mix just because I've been at this for so long. I think what we have to do with this issue is normalize it in a weird way, and I think we're doing that. That it's, you think of climate change, it used to be portrayed as a climate crisis that must be solved. Like you solve the climate crisis. It's an issue of the ages. This is an issue that will take decades. It took decades for us to get into this possible fix. It will take generations to decarbonize to the point where we're not building that bank of emissions. And so normalizing, like, look at what Bill McKibben talks, urgent, 350, blah, blah, blah. But his life is a marathon. So look at his gait, look at his life, his trajectory. He is committed to this issue with urgency and patience at the same time. Those two words I use a lot these days. What is urgency and patience when you combine them? It's engagement, sustained engagement. So get used to it, get comfortable with it in a weird way is my message. And then just stick with it for the long haul, whether it's education, whether it's animation, whether it's communication, whether it's basics. There's tons of basic science to be done. We're not doing enough. But just find your niche. And I think you would agree that I was saying to Michael earlier, the other reality of the climate problem is it's portrayed as super wicked, meaning it's prismatic and complicated. That means everybody can contribute. That's the good news about a super wicked problem. There's something for everyone to do.
Let me take off on that for one more point, which is, you shouldn't give up on the possibility that humans actually can solve big problems. I've always brought back to the fact that when I grew up, which was during the 1950s, they had us diving under desks to avoid what was inevitable, that the Russians would nuke us. It didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen was because over time, countries looked each other in the eye, realized that they had more to gain by trying to, at least in a limited way, cooperate. They didn't put the genie back in the bottle. We're still faced with the problem today, but it's very, very unlikely, despite tensions between us and Russia, that we're actually going to kill each other, at least not in this way. And that may not be very satisfying, but that's progress. And it shows you that human beings can muddle through. It's not pretty. There are losses along the way. You never really entirely solve the problem, but you get to a world which, in some respects at least, is better than the one that you thought you were headed for, which, when I was a kid, was complete annihilation.
There you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for a refreshingly candid conversation, which we don't have enough of. I think it's good to see the charts and the slides, but it's also really important to have a conversation about the science, the communication, the culture, and the politics that underlie it all. So we're so grateful to have the double header tonight with both of you here. Thank you all for spending your evening with us. We're grateful that you could join us, and have a wonderful night.